Right. So how about the port? Is the port the same, red and orange?
No, I would say it's an orange with a little green border around it. And the reason I say that is as recently as 2 years ago, we started looking at what it would take to form a utility, not specifically for this, but we know we have the authority. We know that we have some interest in what that would mean if we needed to. So I'd go orange with a little green around it, and up at the money part, I would put green with a preference toward a utility structure.
Okay. Anyone think that's the wrong thing to write down?
Yeah, I just screamed the whole column on him. Right. Thanks a lot.
Wait for a second.
You are this are.
Did you want to say something, Henry?
Well, I would add that if you can go metro-wide for a property tax vote, you could also theoretically go port-wide and get a GO.
Same base, practically.
Same base.
Yeah.
And actually, well, I was just going to say, from listening to our commissioners, and we have to have some from each of the 3 counties that we serve, Washington County-based commissioners understand this issue a lot. And they understand that the value of this system extends in Washington County, economic development, transportation, everything else. So they get it.
And in fact, Washington County contacted us because they wanted to make sure that we had some momentum on solving this problem.
So did the Metro end up at, was that green? Or?
They have the capacity to raise the money, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
They have the base.
Absolutely.
Okay, new entity. I'm going to suggest that it has to be green on the money side because that's why you're creating a new entity, right?
You wouldn't do it if it wasn't. They have the capacity.
Now, how about the political? Is it the same? Is it 2 red question marks and 2 orange question marks?
I think the first question any voter is going to ask is, we already have Metro. Why do we need a new regional entity?
Because they won't take it.
Once they find out what Metro, we'll try to figure out what Metro
Yes,
is.
that'll work.
Yeah, maybe that'll back us into Metro.
I mean, that's the first thing that strikes me.
Well, that's a good point. I think people can agree in terms of the marketing that we need an overriding organization that does this job. Creating a new one always sends voters running to the closet screaming. And so that's why I don't know if that's politically a very good option.
So I asked that 11 be added to the list because the one challenge with this and this and this and this is focus. Right? You do get focus. And I'm not saying Metro can't do it, or the other, or the county through a utility, but you do get unique focus. So the question is could you sell the unique focus as why it has to happen? I don't know the answer to that.
So I'm not advocating for this, but somebody mentioned the state earlier, and the state has been a partner in this and will continue to be. But, you know, arguably you could create a new state entity because the levy problem is not confined to the Columbia Quarter. There are other parts of the state that have to deal with the issue.
I think if you were, I think that's a critical question. I think if you were limiting the purpose of the entity to levy, maintenance, and construction, capital maintenance, whatever it is, as certification, and you limited it to that, I think you have a better chance, actually. And if it's statewide, you might be able to get to 31, 16, and 1 because this problem exists all over the place.
And there's I don't know, there's what, 10 million IFA requests in business Oregon right now. I mean, the problem is recognized throughout the state.
How is this different than number 3? I'm trying to get my head around.
How what?
How is 11 really that different than number 3?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about regional or state.
The
State's
mechanism of creation. You're going to basically go ask you're going to take a custom-built thing to the legislature, both from a governance and a scope of work perspective, to the legislature and say, pass this. And of course, there'll be debate, but I think that's different than expanding what we currently have.
When you get that question, though, why not just expand the authority of the drainage districts, combine them together?
The mechanism for raising funds at the drainage district is the problem. It's
You
an
would-
inherent property tax compression issue under Oregon law.
But you would definitely get that question.
Yeah.
You'd have to have a good answer. And the other answer to that is just expanding the drainage district leaves you with very fragmented responsibilities and doesn't create a sane, like, rational system.
So what color or question marks do we think should be in G for the new entity?
Is the new entity a regional entity or a state entity?
Yes.
That's what we
Yes.
do.
Yes, it is one of the two.
Yeah.
Can you share how the state of California has set up a system when it comes to funding for capital projects?
So the state of California has the Department of Water Resources, which has a division of flood management within it. And the state functions primarily as a granting organization to locals to do work. But when there is a regional issue that is beyond the jurisdictional boundaries of any particular entity and benefits many different areas, the state will take on a project and will use state GO revenue or general fund revenue and will actually construct a project. So we have a significant bypass which runs around the Sacramento area, which needs to be expanded, and the state is doing that because it benefits 3 counties and 6 cities, and it's just beyond the ability of any one entity to have that broader focus. Now, it's not a great model in California because the state's a little tone deaf on local issues. That might not be an issue in Oregon where I think there's more sensitivity. I mean, there could be a lot more sensitivity and still have problems in Oregon compared to California's tone deafness. But that is one challenge when you create a state entity is you lose the sensitivity to the local issues.
Is there a dedicated revenue stream that supports that flood management function?
It's general fund and general obligation bonds. So you're competing for resources every single year.
Yeah.
And I believe Washington participates at the state level, but not as organized. Are you familiar with the county? Yeah.
So
Washington goes through the Department of Ecology, and then floodplain, basically obligation every 2 years, and they pick projects that are multi-benefit, but it's not like California under DWR. It's kind of this joint collaboration where it's very dependent on what the amount of funding the legislature passes that year, and it varies substantially, and then it's a project list and grant funding.
So is this a red and orange question marks? Because there's
Yellow, I think.
Orange and blue,
Go
green.
yellow.
So if I want to add an evil thought that, both Metro and the port have a statute. And you could go to the legislature and give this problem to either one of them
yes, this
by
is
statute.
By statute.
yes, you
You
could.
could say, let's give it to the Metro Council, and you gotta fix this, and we'll create this entity here, and you're in charge of making the appointments to the board or whatever. That is evil.
So there's a proposal for yellow.
Get evil.
Anyone object to yellow? You don't like?
I've never
Go
been
ahead.
opposed
Just trying to get my head around, so you're saying it's easier politically to create a new entity than it is to just do, number 2, to just do a bunch of IGAs and solve the problem.
The idea of the new entity is you craft something that solves some of the political problems that are inherent to any of the options that are on the table today. And so I think just by the logic of new entity, it's going to be easier. It should be more politically viable. It should solve the revenue problem. But the devil's going to be in what are we going to actually construct there, and then how are all the centerpieces going to fill in.
Yeah, the premise I think is, look, we can do all this stuff which doesn't quite meet our needs, or we can design what meets our needs and is most politically viable, and it's still a challenge, but because it's the best thing that actually meets our needs, maybe that gets you over the political hurdle. That would be the argument.
Is the key in R11 that it's a state-formed entity?
Yeah, it'd be formed by the
State-created entity.
Yeah.
Just the way that Metro and the Port are created.
Yeah, they were both.
Right? The Metro, you could do what Metro does through IGA, but it would be awkward and you'd have all sorts of problems. And the port could be done through IGA, but it would be awkward to have all sorts of problems. The dedication of an entity with imbued powers by the legislature is what makes it work.
I like it because it buys the state in, and I think the state needs to be bought in, so, yellow.
Anyone object to yellow? Carl, you object to yellow?
Going back when number one on is sufficient and sustainable. And you can tell us from California, if you're in the general fund, how much can you say that you have a sustainable?
But you could create, you could do number 11, a legislatively creative entity, and its sustainable funding is utility fees, right? So we're mixing and matching the two. That's right. That is a downside to a state agency. But you gain the benefit of maybe it's more politically saleable to the legislature because every legislator will have a buy-in because their district may be benefited ultimately.
Which makes it even more difficult because then you have to divide the pie with us.
That's true.
Acid and Medford, Gold Beach.
So is yellow middle ground okay? Yeah. Stephanie, you okay with yellow?
If I could just add from a federal perspective that state involvement would be a good thing in any involvement from the federal government. If the state is stepping forward saying this is important enough to us, it helps the argument in any federal or related activities. So state involvement would be a good thing.
So since what we're doing here is we're creating what we're going to take to the executives after Labor Day. Theoretically, we could have a plan A, and plan A could be to develop a legislative concept or whatever, and then plan B could be whichever of these other options we like. But that is our goal.
Yeah. Once we narrow this down, we need to create a pros and cons list for each that'll help us figure out how we really rank them. I'd like to see which ones we can agree come off the table now, so we can narrow our conversation and not do B through F on everything. So it seems pretty clear to me that number one comes off the table. Does everyone agree?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Let's for a moment focus in on 4 through 7, since they're all utility models. Is it clear to everybody how to rank these? Which ones are in the better tier and which ones are in the worst tier?
I think 4 is the worst tier because we currently pull from base that is not compressed, and we would have to expand the cost per resident or landowner significantly to be able to get to green and 4. So I know we've said depending on boundary issue. But to me, the special district overlay versus the special district in the current size, I think that's a better lift.
So I'll note that we've got orange, and we've got orange ringed with red and orange ringed with red. If our colors were right, 6 and 7 are better than 4 or 5.
Yeah, I'll agree to that.
Does anybody think that 4 and 5 are equal to 6 and 7? Or better than 6 and 7?
I think they all have issues, that we have to actually fully vetted.
Right.
I think each you're hearing concern, like Reed, if I wanted to waste people's time, I could just express a bunch of concern about the Multnomah County piece too.
Yeah.
I think they're pretty similar.
So
It's always fun to listen to that.
Yeah.
I want to make a bit of a case for amending the chart.
Okay.
I actually think 6 is impossible without 2. So
yes,
all you're talking about is the number of players that are involved in the agency.
Yeah.
So I would argue that 6 and 2 should merge, and who takes the lead is, I don't know. It seems to me that because we run stormwater utilities already, we would take the lead in whatever conversation there was that we were going to be a signatory to. So I would argue that 6 and 2 are actually merged.
Well, do you even need 4 through 7 if you go for 2? I mean, isn't 2, couldn't all those definitions be made if you picked 2?
includes the joint powers, right?
Yeah, 2 is
Yeah, I
joint
think-
powers.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, 4 and 5 can stand on their own, so can 7.
Well, your point on 6 is for 6 to work, you'd need an IGA with the other
You
cities.
need other
joint
cities.
Okay,
Yeah.
and so we could say new 190 agency, city focused.
Yeah.
Does anyone think that 2 succeeds in any way other than the city being focused? Because we've said it has to be a utility model.
It's going to be very difficult without the cities signing on.
Right.
If in fact if that's the mission statement.
I think in addition to the fact that the cities are responsible for stormwater, they're also the map holders.
Yeah.
And so that
Right.
they
Build
have,
maps.
they
Okay.
have to be able to hand over
Right.
some authority.
That's right.
So any objection to merging 6 into 2, and 2 is city focused?
I do wonder,
2 talk about an IGA to combine powers. As I understand, 6 is an agreement to exercise our existing powers in a coordinated fashion. And so I see the consensual difference there.
I don't know.
I don't understand.
Well, I don't know how you do 6 across the entire landscape without memorializing the agreement between the cities.
You would.
Through it one night.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is 2 says we're going to create something new through this IGA. 6 says we're going to coordinate our existing operations through an IGA.
Well, we're going to take on new operations because we don't currently manage the interior drainage structure inside the district. We pay, but we don't manage it.
well, and I would add one more kind of engineering thing to this issue. So
That's true.
7 is going to require an IGA of
This
some
is
sort of some.
Is the difference between 2 and 6, though, the legal entity?
Yeah,
As
I
opposed to
think
just
some
the
of it's
function.
buried in the other criteria.
Yeah.
That's true.
Okay, well,
You can leave it the way it
I think
is
they're
right
different.
now.
do we agree that 3 comes off? Anyone want to advocate for 3 remaining on? Okay. Do we agree that 8 comes off? It's the only red bottom remaining.
Well, the utility is covered in 7, so
Yeah.
that's the property
Yeah,
tax.
so that's that.
but
This is the
That's
property
tax.
tax
That's
one.
the property tax side of it,
It's
right?
the compression issue.
Right, so does anyone want to advocate for 8 remaining on?
H.
Okay.
Why would I take, I mean, again, why would I take 8 off? I'm leaving 9 on. I don't understand that.
Yeah, I
You
think
might have utility capacity.
That's different, so I'm comparing the 2 scenarios. Property tax is property tax, right?
But this has a larger
Has
geographic
a
area.
larger tax base, but again, it's back to the nuances. It's
So
still
is the
green,
greater
red.
question Utility versus property taxes?
Yeah,
Are we
yeah,
taking
that's-
property tax off the table? and
There's actually,
It does seem like that's happening.
yeah, there's 3 layers to the thing, right? If you stay with the current boundary, you can't do property taxes. You can't levy enough on it with compression, right? So that's off the table. Then you're beyond the boundaries of where you currently serve, and then you've got this question of utilities versus property taxes. You can do property taxes and raise enough money. The problem is you will create compression in some areas, in some places, and you're in all kinds of competition mode with a gazillion other taxing entities depending on the size of the landscape. And that makes it pretty red.
So it seems to me, if we're considering making a presentation to executives, and we have to explain the rationale for whatever we present, that this is a key thing to talk about depending on the choices we make. And we explain why we pick things that were utility-based versus why we do. Not to say we can't do either one, but maybe.
Right, no, absolutely. I think you're,
So should Metro and the Port in the new entity be listed as utility models?
Yeah, that's how I qualify.
This is, and this would be, and this, there was the legal question we didn't have the answer on. Right?
But why not?
So let me ask, going off Stephanie's lead, a question differently. Is there anyone here who thinks that a property tax model is our solution?
Or is less difficult than utility.
Does anybody want a property tax model to be any of the options we retain and explore?
I would say that the only reason why I would say it could be a solution is if you wanted to bifurcate the responsibility.
right.
If you're looking at a capital funding entity versus an operating entity, then I think a geo bond, a funding, or something like that, a property tax-based system, is viable. But if you're looking at something that's integrated and trying to recover costs through a property tax, I think that this gets us right back into the same box that we're in and competes against other operating levies and politically raises the stakes much larger than they would otherwise be.
Okay.
Jeff, can you create an entity that has property tax authority but no permanent rate?
Yes.
Yes. So to get to the bonding question, the capital question, you could create a utility that only used property taxes for capital, voter-approved capital.
For geo bonds. Yeah.
Yeah, that keeps it out of the winter tide.
So if we were going to use property taxes, what is the right geographic boundary to collect property taxes from?
Well, I would suggest at least the entire Multnomah County.
I think it's Metro and Port.
Yeah. So Metro and Port is basically the three counties, three metro counties.
Okay.
I think that's the right base.
Scott doesn't think it'll happen, but
I think you're sort of blowing air at the wind coming into your face a little bit. I mean, last time I went to our operating levy, 26 jurisdictions asked us in a mayoral letter not to go out because of the questions.
okay, so
Doesn't sound like
so everything is going to be a utility model, and Metro and Port could also be a property tax model.
The only use of the property tax in the entity was for voter-approved general obligation debt for capital.
Right.
It doesn't create compression.
Right, exactly. So, and it sounds like the new entity potentially could use.
That's right.
Right.
Even if you had a new entity, you could do that.
So these three could be utility or property.
Or both. They could levy
Or
a-
some combination of both.
You have a combination.
Right.
You can do
Okay.
a utility for operating and then levy a geo bond occasionally for capital.
Right. And these are only utility models.
I think they could use property tax for capital as well, but.
If, under an IGA, you would have the joint ability to issue revenue bonds. You couldn't use GO under the entity, but you could do revenue bonds jointly
Right.
under your current state law.
And one of the jurisdictions could ask voters for general.
Any one jurisdiction.
Right, and so then you don't even have to get into consolidation of various districts, right? So if there's.
Just you're creating something.
So
Or
is
if it
the
were
only
retro.
reason Multnomah County is crossed off because property tax is your only option for Multnomah County?
That's
They have
the property tax one.
Okay, but it's
The
staying in
permanent
for
rate.
Yeah.
They just don't, establishing a new permanent rate inside the $10 cap is going to create so much compression that I don't think there's a.
Right. Don't forget, this is still Multnomah County. We're not canceling the county. We're saying if you're going with only property, why would you do it just limited to the county? You would do it in a larger geographic area. Okay. So I'm going to suggest we grab food and eat while we finish. And hopefully starting to eat will help us get clarity on how we knock some more of these out. It may be we're beyond knocking out and we just need to pick favorites, right? We've tried knocking out and we were able to eliminate 3, but now we're down to 8. And so we might have to just do some straw votes to see what people's favorites are at this point. So why don't we take a 10-minute break to grab food? Okay,
And
thanks,
if I
Kevin.
could add, we're clearly not going to have enough time to fill in every box on the grid today, but if we could quickly go through D and E, the division of responsibilities is D and the fairness is E. I think it would be beneficial to go through that on some of these options that we want to pursue.
That might help sort out
It may.
Yeah.
what we keep.
So let's take a break, just enough time to get food, and then we'll come back. I've added a new category down here, which is the solar multi-purpose. And Henry and I were talking about it, and our view is that option number 2, the new 1090 agency, option 4, which is the special district, 5, which is the overlay, and 11, which is the new entity, would all be sole purpose. And then obviously anything that's within the leadership of cities or county or metro or the port is a multi-purpose agency. It would be adding a duty to it. I'm not sure it necessarily helps you pick which one, but it maybe adds clarity as to coming back to this sheet up here on the wall, which were the advantages to sole and disadvantages, and the advantages to multi and disadvantages. So it's something else to think about. I've also put up on this sheet what I thought I heard from folks about funding models, which is the utility model could be a winner. Property tax could be a winner only if it's a large enough area. And it seemed like the consensus was if you were going to go property tax, you would go the port or the metro areas and expand it beyond just the county. And then for entities that would have the option for property tax, you would also have the hybrid model, where you could do both. And so it may be that if the hybrid model is important to people, that alone could focus you in on 9, 10, or 11 only, because they're the only that can do the hybrid. So that's a conversation we can have about these different funding models and which we think make the most sense and which ones we prefer.
190 can do a hybrid with revenue.
Oh, okay.
7
can't do GO, but can do revenue.
7 can do a hybrid too, because the county could go out for a GO bond.
And the cities go as well?
Oh, yeah, so.
Okay. But, so you're focusing on the hybrid as revenue versus GO.
No, I'm just focusing on a utility versus the ability to issue bonding. Capital.
Okay. So we were going to talk about B through F or 2 through 6 in the different criteria. And I don't want to shortchange the conversation, but I'm not convinced that most of them actually add much clarity. Because, for example, Democratic, I'm guessing we wouldn't create a new entity and say it had no democratic controls. So it's going to be democratic, right? Anything we do, I'm guessing, is going to be. So I don't want to foreclose it, but I also don't want to spend a lot of time on it unless we think there's much there to talk about. So let's go back to the criteria. And criteria 2 is cost efficiency. The proposed governance structure minimizes the cost of providing needed services, taking into account overhead costs. Do we feel like we can grade number 2 for cost efficiency in a way different than 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, and 11? Does anyone see a distinction between them on cost efficiency?
Maybe it's easier to think about new entity, the existing versus new, because existing are going to be relatively efficient, relatively speaking, but a brand new entity that doesn't exist and a new board and a separate organization structure carries with it a whole lot of overhead that's already in place with these other ones. So like a new entity or new county service district, something like that, that model seems to me that it's just going to, by its nature, be more expensive to carry versus a 190 where we've taken advantage of existing organizations. Yeah, there'll be some additional friction in there, but nothing like standing up a new organization.
So I think these are probably the easiest to make that distinction on that you've made, Ken, which is that new entity is probably less cost efficient than port or metro because of existing structures. But is 190 on either extreme, or is it really in the middle?
I don't think it's that much different than existing. It's just an extension of what is already being done. It's not like a new entity. We don't have to create a new entity that creates its own separate budget and has its own separate audit and has its own separate, way in which it has to do business. I just see it as an extension of what already exists. There's additional work, but it's not creating a whole infrastructure underneath that thing to be able to function. And that's how I'm looking at it. Maybe I'm not. Maybe there's more to it than.
You wouldn't have to do those with an IGA?
Not the way I've seen them work in Oregon, where you don't have a. I don't think that. Well, maybe Jeff can add some commentary. Does it have its own separate budget under state budget law, and does it have its own?
It's not subject to local budget law. Benefits. You do have to account for it separately. You do have to follow the accounting principles.
Ultimately, the signatories have to approve it at their own entity in public in a transparent way. So that's the oversight role of public entities.
So one could argue that's inefficient because now a budget has to be approved by 8 entities instead of by 1 entity.
But it's part of the budget that over-approved.
My own division of the IGA loans that you use, you figure out a way to transition existing the right program, so that we wouldn't necessarily have to be creating a whole new democracy.
This whole discussion about cost and efficiencies is going to get really complicated really fast. If, no matter which one of these you pick, I would submit that if it's a brand new entity, they will negotiate their first agreement. And if it's a regional entity, they will pick Metro and the Port and other regional entities as their comparators, or other utilities that are supplying similar services as the comparators. And guess what? We'll be one of the comparators, which will drive their costs higher than they are today, probably. If we're a co-signer to a 190 agreement, all boats will rise to whoever the highest paid group is. Everyone else will do a me too in the first agreement that you come to. So creating anything new that involves current players in this region is going to be more expensive on a per employee basis than what you have today.
Okay.
So I think if you were comparing them, I don't think there's a big difference between them regarding those costs. If personnel costs are going to be a significant part of the O&M. Capital side's different, but.
Steve?
So is there not a scenario under number 2 that enables kind of the current maintenance structure and non-union environment and that type of arrangements that could keep costs lower than a new model under the other scenarios?
It's a question of the political limits. I think there's a possibility, but I think for the most part, the political limits haven't hit us yet. And it would probably perpetuate the conversation faster with any change. I think that's.
Could you not create a new entity under state law and say that the port or Metro shall provide the services for it, and then you don't have the inefficiencies?
You create the entity for the sole purpose of governing and financing.
Exactly. And so then you wouldn't necessarily have the increased cost of a new entity.
Have a separate contract with somebody.
Which the 190 exists with the contract review board, and that can be added to. New members, new parties can be added to that. Already has broad authorities.
Yeah.
The board has limited itself by policy not to go too far too fast. So it exists.
So is there a conclusion on whether cost efficiency is a relevant factor here?
I think it's a consideration for later, personally.
Always a relevant factor.
I think it's more of a how than a what.
Okay. Does it deserve more discussion now? Okay. So C, legal. Jeff, you hear that word legal? You're going to get called on here. Adequate legal authority.
My comment about that is taking into account item 2 on the blackboard over on the whiteboard over there about maximizing community values. If whatever entity takes on 1 doesn't have the authority to expand out and be responsive to the community's interests, other interests that might be embedded in 2, then the legal authorities may be too narrow. So I tend to opt for broader legal authorities that are then constrained more by policy than by the actual statutory authority.
Okay,
so an example is if water quality, add on. Recreational management, add on. Mitigation bank, gee, we want to do that, let's add it on. But you don't want to have to go to the legislature every time the board wants to add on a function.
So do either 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, or 11 not meet that criteria?
Well, all of the special district solutions would not meet that criteria because they're limited purposes means of government, and they can only do what they're legislatively delegated to do. You can fix that with legislation, but under the current available knowledge, you can do that. The city, the county, the metro are all charter entities. They have broad powers and could do all of those things.
And if you're using a utility funding model, there's got to be a nexus from the service provision cost and the allocation of that across the entity, whatever it is. So you run into real complications by expanding scope with your financing model, let alone authority.
So it sounds like you've got orange at 4 and 5 and green, or orange at 4 and 5 and port and maybe metro and maybe the new entity, because they're all going to need some kind of legislative change moving forward to accomplish the broader goals, but perhaps 2 and 6 and 7 is green because they have the existing authorities.
Yeah, but I don't know if I would do this as orange because you wouldn't create it with a problem and then change it to fix the problem. You would create it in the first place so it didn't have a problem.
You were creating something out of whole cloth. You create
Right. You try to give it the authority to do what you want.
And we could say the same, I mean, we could say they're all green.
Yeah, on number 11, I agree. I mean, if you're referring to create it, they all ought to be green, except for probably, I don't know.
Well, but I do hear that these two may be orange.
No, I just mean.
Oh, here, everything is
Yeah.
green, right. Yeah, it probably is. It probably is, you're right. Does everyone
Yes.
agree that the special districts are orange under
Yes.
legal authority because they are more restrictive? Okay. These are the weakest markers. Okay. Now, 190, green or orange? On legal authority. Green?
You can give it the authority we already have.
And then 6 and 7, green, because they're general authority agencies that can do this kind of stuff. And 9 and 10, are they green or orange?
I think they're kind of orange right now.
10's green.
I think they're,
So I can add a point of clarity now, I guess. So going back to the sort of the political Bible, and it sort of touches on what you're touching on now. So under our charter, under the metropolitan concerns provision, generic provision, we could add a new authority, new responsibility, requires a vote of impact and is referable to the voters, or it has to be voted on in general. One of the two conditions.
And you don't have any existing authorities that would cover environmental or recreation?
They're very narrowly defined at this
Okay.
point. It would be difficult to interpret that, at least on the, this is a preliminary read from our council.
So that sounds orangey then.
I would
And
say
is
it's
this orange, Phil, or is this green? This is green?
Yeah.
You gotta be careful, you're creating yourself
It's
as the
local
target
government.
for everybody here.
Yeah, that's when we overlay on local government.
Go down to the bottom and it might look different.
We always knew that Phil was going to be in charge of everything.
That's a
That was,
judgment call. That's
that
not
yeah,
bad.
that was the plan.
Okay.
So still, it's called legal.
No, I'm concerned about that.
Okay, number 4, sensible and clear division of responsibilities. The governance structure minimizes the need to routinely coordinate across agencies in order to perform necessary functions. Functions that naturally belong together are placed in the care of the same agency. Now this is a lot of different meanings, right? This is
Yeah,
capital versus O&M. This is flood versus land use. This is flood versus all your other activities. Is there much of a distinction other than, as usual, the new entity gets green?
4 and 5 are orange because a special district is not going to have land use authority.
Well, with the new entity?
The new entity is, that's probably orange.
Could.
So the county doesn't have land use authority in any relevant.
Yeah, I think as a practical matter, they're all the same probably. They're either all orange or all yellow or all green because you could argue that the city has land use authority, but it doesn't have land use authority in the other cities. And the other cities aren't going to give it. And if the other cities gave it, they could just as easily give it to the county.
But the county already gave the land use authority to the city.
Here, take it back.
As much as
So
I think 6, when you combine it with 2,
6.
works. But I think
Yes.
the rest are orange.
That's correct, yeah.
So is this a useful one to color in, or do we move? Phil thinks it's useful to color.
6 and 2 green and like draw a line between them and 11 and 4.
6 and 2 green.
With the caveat that the city of Portland has a lot of bureaus, and there'd be like 4 or 5 different bureaus involved.
Oh, it's black.
It's just one set.
You can also get to the end of the meeting.
What?
Okay, and everything else is orange? Is that what I heard? 4 and 5 are
Depending on
orange?
which commissioner gets assigned.
What color did you decide that all of B was? They were all common, the second one, which is complete.
We didn't pick a color.
No, it doesn't matter.
Well, we should have deferred that
Is
question.
7 orange?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
county's orange. And Metro, orange.
Yeah.
And the port probably is orange on this one too, right?
Correct.
Okay, next time we're going with finger paints. Okay, E, fairness. This is, yes. Beneficiaries contribute to the cost of the flood risk management system approximately in proportion to the benefit they receive. Does anyone see much of a distinction between the different ones on this? Or is it already captured in the fact that we've made this, created this framework up here? Carl?
I think the larger geographies distribute it better than the narrower geographies.
Yeah,
So
I think so.
metro and port.
The largest entities have the ability to distinguish benefits and burdens better.
So that would
I'm
mean,
also thinking that the benefits extend beyond the boundaries of the existing districts, and so
Right.
getting a
That's
capture
right.
on them might as well.
I think
so that would mean
2,
that
9, 10, and 11, right?
2, 9, 10, well, and these two could be because these weren't stuck with the original boundaries.
Right, they could be larger.
So it would be everything other than 6 and 7 would be green and 6 and 7 would be orange.
Correct.
Is that agreement?
That works. Except that the number 2, to get to the same as Metro Port new entity, would probably need 28 participants.
Oh, that's a good orange.
I don't think 4 and 5 are going to be larger geographically than Multnomah County. So to me, those seem somewhere in the same neighborhood as 6 and 7 for fairness.
I'm not catching up with you, man.
So is this greenish orange? Orange?
I'd say orange.
Everyone in favor of orange? Anyone in favor of green? All right. Everybody else just wants to leave.
Green. All depends on what the
Okay, F. What did I do with F?
Democratic control.
Democratic control and equitable decision making. The governance structure is under democratic control and is designed to foster equitable decision making.
The port director.
So if the port took this over, what would the governance look like?
Well, I think the discussion was elected or appointed was one set of binary choices. The port's appointed, so that would be at least orange, if not red.
You're going to be less democratic.
Yes.
Put it that way.
Okay.
And this is where you're
We elect.
No.
The others are all responsible to an elected board at some level. 190 should be slightly better than the port, but maybe not quite as good as a group of cities, although it's similar.
I'm not so sure the 1 acre, 1 vote of the special districts is considered democratic. That, I think that's up for debate. So I would suggest that by report, that's probably orange.
Reed, it depends what century you're in.
So Reed, your proposal is that 4, 5, and 10 would be orange, and 11, 9, 6, and 7 would be green, And based on Michael's comment, maybe 2 is orangey green?
You know, it's just that 190 agencies tend to run below the radar.
Yeah.
And the electeds are one step removed. And they're diffused across all the players. That's why I think it's a little less democratic.
So does everyone agree that 4, 5, and 10 are orange? Any
You
disagreement?
could go red on 10.
Oh, you're not
4,
bad.
5, and 10 are
You're getting
orange.
nervous now, Phil?
He's trying to manage the scorecard. I just want to note there's nobody from Clackamas County, Washington County in this room. So just to know.
Okay. And then 9,
Doesn't count.
9, 6, 7, and 11 are green. Thank you for taking the studio over. I was getting a little high from the smell.
Oh, that's some bright green.
That's a good green. 6, 7, and
Somebody
11.
really likes Metro.
Just
The trick is to switch markers every square. It resets them a little bit. And 11.
Exactly. I'm trying to shrink the portfolio.
And then this is orangey. Oh, that's not. That's like yellow.
This is a real.
I think
this
would be. I guess I would just defer to Ray,
Okay.
Roland, and Steve to hearken on if this were reversed, and Clackamas County were trying to create this under Metro's authority, and you were a passive bystander, how would you react? Is that a democratic?
Purely because it's one representative form of government with the vote?
We wouldn't feel as connected at all.
Well, my observation looking at it is 4 and 5 probably either fall off the list or they're really near the bottom of the list.
I put the same orange circle around F in Metro that you have too. Is that what you're suggesting?
I put it around the new entity too. I mean, every new entity conversation is either going to the port, going to Metro, going to create some new kind of scheme that is probably going to be appointed. I mean, it might be.
So an orange circle around 11.
Basically, being elected Metro Council is less democratic than being elected county commission.
We have a bigger base.
It's true.
So is there any appetite for considering, I mentioned Plan A and Plan B earlier, that proposing legislation to create a new entity would be one option that might be pursued, but that also another option would be pursued or be waiting in the wings if that didn't work? I mean, I'm sort of thinking ahead to how this is presented to the executives. And, you know, they might not have the appetite to go for a whole full-on legislative package, even if we think that's, even if the colors would tell us that's what we all think we ought to do. But then we ought to have maybe one of the other options as fallbacks.
Yeah.
Let's do a binary now.
So, and actually, Henry, in the interest of time, because we have about 7 minutes till the admin subcommittee, you guys can leave.
Yes.
What happens next with all of this?
Well, let me pause you just for 1 second. I want to see if I can officially cross 4 and 5 off, so it's not on everyone's mind in the future. Does anyone object to 4 and 5 being crossed off? Okay.
And while you're doing that, just comment on the colors. Now, the colors aren't going to decide our options. This is just going to narrow it down, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, unless going back to
It's
the,
all green.
You got a
Doesn't mean that's what
whole
we
another
want to
level
do.
of research.
So,
Right.
so the next steps are to continue to evaluate and fill in some blanks on the options that we're still considering. And I think on several of these, there's questions that we still need to figure out exactly what we mean by, say, option 11. So we have work to do filling in the blanks and researching them. That'll be the agenda for the next couple months, and then the goal is to bring a recommendation to the project team in September and the executive meeting around the same time, probably with a fallback option in case they don't agree with us.
Remind you to say that day.
I think three things before we get out of here really quickly. One is is 2 substantially different from 6 or 7? Do we want to keep that as a separate option? And if so, what does it mean? And secondly, maybe we could go around the outside of the room quickly and just ask folks to identify what they think are the options most worth pursuing.
On 2, we've got the word utility written in there. With the word utility written in there, I think combine 2 and 6.
Yeah, I'll offer an observation as the outsider who doesn't have the vested interest, is I think you've actually created a bit of a tiering hierarchy. And that's just my observation based on the coloring and the dialogue. Doesn't mean you necessarily can do 11. There might be lots of reasons you can't. But this is kind of what I've heard, and I thought maybe if I threw that out, people could react to that as you go around.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I might put the triangle on the side.
I don't know that I would show it that way. I got to go back over here for a minute. I'm still I'm struggling with why Multnomah County got pulled off on the property tax side even.
Because if it was only limited to property,
yes,
then why wouldn't we go a larger property base of beneficiaries and not stick to just the jurisdictional political boundary, which has no connectivity to the actual benefits that people are getting?
Actually, that's arguably the most connectivity to the benefits, but just because it's the only jurisdiction that actually touches all elements of it. You're trading, it's trade-offs. People are going to see a more direct connection of Multnomah County to the benefits than, I would argue, a 3 jurisdictional area, even though it's a larger tax base, I get it. But you got a lot more hoops to jump through to get there.
I would say that, I think you might be able to pass a general obligation bond countywide to address some of the capital needs,
right.
But if you go countywide as opposed to City of Portland, you don't gain a lot of yes voters, and you don't gain a lot of money. So, it's, if you're, what problems are you solving, and what kind of voter base and tax base do you need to solve them? I think going out for a levy, adding into the $10 cap on a permanent rate, I don't think any of that's politically viable countywide.
Your same argument I would apply to, again, I would still apply that same argument to Metro, because I can go out to a larger base, yes, I can get more money, yes. I would add a lot of no votes.
But didn't we?
There's a lot of no votes.
But didn't we, aren't we going to use a utility? Isn't our preferred mode, and number 8 is a property tax base? Right.
That's the difference. But 9 as a utility would require, under our charter, to take it to a vote.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So you, okay.
So do you want to go around the outside?
Go ahead.
Let's go around the outside. So I think we basically merged 2 into 6, and that leaves us with 5 options, 6, 7, and 9 through 11 as continuing to pursue. Let's go around the outside and just quickly sound people out. Any comments? You don't have to make a comment.
I was just interested that you put 6 and 7 below 9 and 10.
Yeah, right.
Especially with 2 in there, you've got more.
That's true.
Yeah, it's a legitimate observation. I did it because I was trying to imagine the level of coordination that has to occur at the 6 and 7 level. You're going to have IGAs between a whole bunch of different entities to get stuff done. And I was looking at 9 and 10 and 11 and thinking the only coordination that really has to occur is the land use coordination. But this is just based on sitting through 3 hours and listening. It's not based on the history of the region.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that at that point, 9 becomes very untenable because the political hurdles that you have to overcome are so multivariate and layered that it makes the other issues in the smaller jurisdictions look paltry. We have people around this table that represent jurisdictions that would like Metro to get as far away from everything as possible, and I don't see why this conversation would be different than any of the others that we have.
Okay, it's fair. You can cross off my triangle.
I actually think 6 plus 2 would be the easiest thing to do, but 11 would be the best if we could get everything we want.
That's interesting. Almost to Stephanie's point.
Right.
but we have made a lot of efforts to communicate broadly about the fact that there are a set of levees along the Columbia River. And there seems to be great and reasonable hesitation about bringing this to the voters or having any kind of legislative change. But it is also a continued opportunity to communicate to the region about these assets. So while it's definitely politically challenging, it continues to offer that opportunity.
So personally, I feel like when Metro was created to deal with regional problems of land use and economic development, to me this falls within that mission. I understand there are political sensitivities, but to me that is the founding principle of the regional government. Additionally, I like having a levy for a levy. That's my 2 cents.
Slow levy.
You just want to use that.
I think I would just offer that the conversation today, I think there was a lot of agreement in certain things like expanding the regional scope and focusing on utility models, and those places of consensus might be good places to start thinking about organizing. Like we might not just have to narrow to these options, but think about those places where there was a lot of consensus and build some models on that agreement as a way to move towards the next step.
I sit on a national board for flood protection and stormwater management, and looking around the U.S., it seems like 11 works well for a lot of other agencies. So I think it would be a good model to follow.
I mean, 11 would be great. I think it's a much longer term, bigger lift to get there. I think Metro is a logical choice for work in politics in our region, and board seems like it might be something that could be pushed through a little bit easier to me, but Phil's comment on that.
Back in.
11 provides the greatest flexibility, but the greatest climb, I mean, to achieve that, that's a big lift. It's undefined what it is. It's a lot of ambiguity stored in. You know, is it tagged on to an existing organization, or as Ken said, is it for standing something up? That's questionable if that's a good step to take. Setting up an entirely new organization.
I have no insight to add.
Okay. You want to do the same thing around the table?
You get like 3 minutes, read my time.
Okay, well, final thoughts and questions for our next month of work. And then with the awareness that we're going to take probably 5 options, it sounds like, to the project team in 3 weeks. So next steps, final thoughts.
Well, I have a question. Would a continuation of this session a month or 2 from now with additional thought on these be helpful, or are we beyond working sessions and you just need to vote on something?
June 14th is the next governance subcommittee meeting, regular schedule.
But is the focus of it a workshop like this, or should the focus be, I've reviewed the report that Henry prepared and now I'm prepared to pick something?
We have a lot of work in the mill, financial analysis, things like that needs to get completed and then discussed and deliberated. So I don't think within the month or 2 months, well, maybe 2 months, but within the month, we're not going to be ready to declare a decision because we have some input we're waiting for.
Yeah, and I think the next meeting, one of our agenda items will be to probably flesh out number 11. What really would it mean?
You also have a meeting July 12th.
Yeah.
Okay.
Final thoughts? Phil wants to volunteer the port to do it all.
He wore green.
Keep in mind, what we're doing is setting something up for decades, and so keep that in mind. Second, I just want to check to see what about this conversation we're going to take outside the room at this point, and if we're going to consider this just a work in progress. what we're gonna allow ourselves to talk about at our respective agencies and all that. So is there any, I mean, I'll just put it out there for myself. I'll go back and report out to our executive team that the nature of the conversation, what the result is from a conceptual point of view, and that we have a lot more work to do.
Okay.
But I'm not going to declare a group preference or anything like that, but I'd like to have some understanding amongst the group here about how we're going to communicate the results of today.
I think you can communicate that 6 options were taken off the table, which is a good thing because it communicates that you're making movement. And now that you've narrowed it, we need more information to further narrow it.
I think that aligns with what I would expect. I mean, I expect everybody's going to want to communicate with their electeds or supervisors about, you know, what's still on the table. I don't think we should declare that we've reached any conclusions except that we took several off the table. And I think we should communicate to people that we have more work to do and more thinking ahead before we reach a conclusion. But you know, of course, this is an open public meeting. Nothing here is secret, and indeed, we're on camera.
You're going to the video on.
Yeah. You know, I certainly don't think anyone should conceal anything that was discussed here today. But I also don't want folks to freak people out by saying that we've decided that, you know, Christian's going to be in charge of it all.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say 7 also is like kind of the same as 6. It just winds up, it'll be a bunch of IGA stuff. I mean, but I do agree that some kind of 190, some kind of city thing, and then some kind of new entity thing. It looks like those are the things that we should really drill down on.
Reed, you want the final comment?
Just what I take away from this, to your point, progress was made. We took some things off the table, and the things we took off the table was anything close to the status quo. That there was no expanding the status quo to solve the problem. There was a large step that needs to be made within the community to solve the challenges that we put on the board. So that's what I take away. After that, I don't think it's clear because I think there's a lot of due diligence to do between them.
Okay, you guys. That's enough. And video guys, you don't have to film this next part because we're in the subject matter.
So Stephanie, just 10 seconds. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to do this.